Welcome everyone, and thank you again for joining us. We're going to get started as a few more folks trickle in here. I'm Jonathan Dolan, the research lead at Future State. And for those of you who are not yet familiar, Future State is a new initiative based at the United Nations Foundation. And we're working to ensure that personal data that is generated from digitization is governed in a way that empowers individuals, becomes a driver of positive development outcomes, and upholds the values of open societies. Today's conversation is the second installment in a webinar series that we hope will be an ongoing series dedicated to exploring data governance models that maximize the potential of the data economy while also protecting against misuse. In our first webinar, we heard from 4 innovative models for democratizing access to data. We heard from Pramod Varma and Sid Shetty, who discussed India's data empowerment and protection architecture. We heard from John Bruce, who discussed a new commercial venture called Interopt, which John is launching with Sir Tim Berners-Lee and is based on solid architecture that's aiming to decentralize control of the internet. Third, we heard from Julian Ranger, who discussed his company DigiMe, that aggregates individuals' personal data and enables individuals to control with whom and how data is shared. And last but not least, we heard from Greg Fair at Google, who described the Data Transfer Project, a consortium of technology companies building data interoperability tools to enable users to easily and securely transfer their data from one service provider to another. Across these 4 presentations, really 4 themes emerged from our last conversation. And I'm just going to quickly do a summary of those 4 to give a little context to today's conversation. First is that to really maximize the value of the digital era, we need to focus on sharing more data, not less. Currently, we see a lot of responses to the risks of the rise of availability of data. And the response is often to suppress data flows. But each of the presenters in the last webinar made a compelling case that it's not about suppressing data flows to protect against risk. It's about reimagining how data flows are managed, who has control, who has insights into how data is being used and represented. A second theme that emerged from the last conversation was that giving people control over their data really is essential to democratizing the digital era. Right now, as we all know, data is frequently consolidated in the hands of just a few. And while there's great commercial value in a lot of that consolidation, it ultimately limits the broader utility of data. And giving people more control over their data has the potential to both create broader value as well as minimize some of the potential misuses. Third, we heard that data portability, data sharing really drives competition. From each of the presenters, we heard various iterations of the idea that a thriving innovation ecosystem really requires equal access to data, and that companies who are data-driven, their value is data-driven, really should be competing on the quality of their products, not the limitations or the fences that are being put around data. And lastly, and most relevant for today's conversation, we heard that scale of these systems really is going to require interoperability and a trusted ecosystem. And on that last point, in the conversation in our last webinar, we started to talk about how standards, both technical standards and go-to-market commercial standards, are going to be critical pieces to helping build the trusted ecosystem. But what we didn't really get to too much was what all of that means for consumers. And as we reflected on the conversation at the last webinar, we really started to think about, if these systems are wildly successful and we end up with a really rich, dynamic data sharing environment where we are extracting as much value as possible from the avalanche of personal data that is out there today, how can individuals, how can consumers really have trust in the way their data is being shared and represented. What else is needed besides technical standards and commercial standards for trust to take root in the ecosystem? And also, what happens when problems arise? What are the redressal options? What are the channels for addressing concerns in a dynamic data sharing environment? And that's really what we're diving into today. And so, to help us examine these questions, I'm really pleased to introduce 3 people who have all been thinking about these questions a lot. First, we'll hear from Linar Vik, one of the founders of the Estonian e-Governance Academy and director of the Smart Government Program. Next, we'll hear from Venki Hariharan, a senior fellow at the IDFC Institute, who leads the Institute's work on data governance. And third, we'll hear from Aneet Mukherjee, a policy fellow at the Center for Global Development, where he works on issues of governance, public finance, and service delivery in developing countries. So before I turn it over to Linar, just quickly, for those of you who joined us for our last webinar, just wanted to mention that we'll be taking a slightly different approach to sequencing the conversation today. So we have 3 presentations, each of which will be roughly 15 to 20 minutes. Following each of the presentations, we'll do some brief Q&A with the presenters, as opposed to the last time where we ran through all the presentations and then had Q&A. So just keep your questions in mind for each presenter. Feel free to use the chat function in the webinar to send questions our way, and we can help organize those. But there's also there'll be an opportunity to ask questions directly as well. Lastly, one last logistical point, we'll be recording the webinar and making it available. So just to let you know that. And with that, I will turn it over to Linar. Let me just pull up his presentation. And Linar, are you there?
Yes, hello, good evening.
Great, thank you very much.
I presume you can hear me well.
Yes, we can. And I have just shared your slides with the group, so feel free to indicate when to move on to the next slide.
Thank you. Once again, good evening from my time zone to everybody who has joined this webinar. And I would like to share a very robust approach to the data sharing and trust building architecture of digital society, which is based very much on the secure and trusted interoperability framework. And I would jump into that immediately by having 2 notions that too often we expect that digital services which are society-wide and in a sense core fundamentals for the society would be reality overnight. No, it takes time, and I will show later on in my presentation how number of the services which are dedicated towards opening up an access to the data and building up the interoperability between the data classes takes decade, if not longer, and it requires a lot of persistence because it's not only about building the institutions and public IT systems towards data interoperability, but it requires also end users, citizens and businesses to get used to the services and to focus on the value which they get from the digital services. And of course, the focus of my approach is a case for Estonia, recognized also as one of the most digitized nations right now. And when we are talking about the phenomenon of Estonia, then the most simplest is to put it in that way that Estonia has achieved with investing 10 times less public money per capita the digitalization levels and use of the services, which is among the top 10 countries in most of the fields. But the case of Estonia starts really from one notion which is difficult for many countries to repeat, we started from the scratch. We started from the scratch by regaining our independence in early 1990s, and we were able to rebuild all the public administration functions, but also the public databases principles from the new and modern perspective. Second one, what is often missing, especially when we're talking about OECD countries with high development levels, there is really no need and hunger, because most of the society is happy already with services what they get. Rather, they are afraid that if there will be a change, and digitalization also drives one of those change processes right now, there will be less services available, or there will be more demanded from the end user. The three cornerstones that Estonian society had when we started our process were about building an access to the digital services, or access to the internet at that time, building also skills for the end users to know what services and how could be used, and to build the services. And when we're talking about almost 2 decades ago, then the first services were services like basic web browsing and email services. And this is actually one of the learning points for us. We started without data regulation or the digital public services regulation, but we started by having a lot of de facto processes accepted as a norms, as a new digital norms, which means that if you wrote an email without any digital signature, without anything else, to any public authority, then you got an answer, which was not legally signed or digitally signed, but it was something which helped you out. So, for example, if you wrote to a tax department email address asking advice about your case, you most probably received an answer within a day. Your question was not legitimate from the document management and public administration information flow perspective, and the response from the tax department was neither legally binding, but it helped people to get used to the fact that digital channels drive actual value with actual services. And this became later on really the norm, where all the services, and when we're talking about public services, then it's data-driven services, which in 21st century context, of course, are all digital data-driven services. They are all designed user-centric, not government, ministry, or agency-centric. And when you start building user-centric services, you recognize immediately that in order to deliver a service for a citizen or for a business, you require actually an access or sources of data from multiple different registries. There is no one super database which covers all the government information, but you need to combine the different database fields with the content to deliver the service to the end user. And that was something where we recognized the utmost importance of the interoperability framework. And that was also the moment since what Estonia never talked again about sharing the data, where we actually are, in a sense, really bad, but we are enabling access to the data, which means that there is a framework, interoperability framework, which is a legally binding and also regulatorily enforced secure data exchange framework for all public institutions and also all the private institutions who won't have an access to that if they meet the technical standards and regulatory terms, which are not very difficult ones. And this is why most of even the SMEs, not talking about the banks or telecom or utility companies, have gained a value from having an access to the digital data, starting from the geoinformation systems, ending up with the different core factors which make their services valuable to the end user. And another area after framing the interoperability importance, we understood that technology is not something which comes first, but during the design process where you are trying to adopt and introduce a new technology, the regulatory, legislative, and also institutional support process needs to be initiated right away. So legislation goes very much hand in hand with technology, and in legislation we don't have an IT or data legislation. Yes, we have data protection legislation, and in European Union the GDPR is something which is enforced all over the European Union, but the legislation which deals with child care, the legislation which deals with social care, the legislation which deals with an environmental protection, or which deals with licensing activities in food processing, they need to embed into their legislation aspects that enable them to use digital solutions and make their field of service digital. And this is a way where all government agencies, all ministries are also digital agencies, not one champion who has to push and drive and convince other ministries to come, but all them are responsible for their digital agenda. And interoperability framework is something which is creating really the data access environment framework. And really that dealt and led us to the point where we can say that public sector has started to lead the digital transformation innovation process, and the utilities, banks, the technology sector were the ones who came and followed later on. All the choices we make have been always extremely pragmatic. Pragmatic meaning also that when you keep an end user in mind, then the focus has not been on saving money to the public institutions or with the digitalization, but it has been saving time and money for the end users. A very simple example, by enabling digital signature for society and by recognizing every Estonian citizen saves 5 days per every year just by using a digital signature architecture in Estonia. By using an automated reporting, an average SME saves 4 working days per every month by not having the bureaucratic reporting procedures to the tax department, but accepting the pre-filled reports and using the digital reporting systems. Those are actual functions which save time and money for the individuals, companies, and that is something which is always a focus right now also in a service development. So this is an overall framework which we are using and utilizing, and then maybe just to run through also shortly the timeline of the processes where I need to explain that not everything starts in one moment, in one day. You have a roadmap, and there are some areas which are crucial and very critical for the enabling access to the data, ensuring also control over the data, making sure that the quality of data and quality of services are ensured, and in the same time building up the interoperability framework. To put it in a nutshell, if you want to run a country or digital services in the nationwide level, you need to build 3 core registries: population, land, and business registries, and then create an opportunity to make an interoperability or data sharing between those registries, which cover then the fundament for the most of the other services. You can't build an e-health services without having a population registry, or without having a licensed medicaments registry, or doctors registry. And they are all based on the core fundamental databases or registries of the government, and the interoperability and data sharing between those registries is one of the aspects and factors that is ensuring also the quality of data assurance. We started when of course, we started in mid-1990s already, but for the sake of the time, I start from 2000 when all the companies and private citizens started to declare their taxes over internet. And you have to make a notion here, the digital signature and ID card were introduced only a couple of years later. So it was already something which we could say a trust without legislation from the government side was in place. And the trust or the authentication architecture we used was to use an internet banking credentials for people and businesses to log into public services. So tax department, business registry were the first ones, followed with a digital population registry. And immediately in 2001, we recognized that population registry and business registry need to have interoperability and data sharing connection. But if you make a bilateral connections between the two different registries, the complexity of those interconnections grows exponentially over the time. If you want to build up the next registry and make also interconnection with all the other registries and next one, the complexity grows logarithmically, and there is no way to assure the quality of those interconnections. So immediately we also introduced Interoperability Framework, which can be used also by all other private or public registries. 2002, one of the 2 biggest cornerstones, digital signature together with electronic ID card, were issued countrywide and started to use. And once again, the first year of usage was less than 5%, less than 7% in most of the services. And to reach a significant penetration, like now, virtually 98% of all the tax declarations are submitted over internet, it takes a good 10 to 15 years to reach this level of saturation or this level of penetration of the services. In 2003, a land registry followed with a multiple layer based geoinfo system, and that system is as a principle used still and also accessible for the private utility companies, architects, real estate developers. So everybody has an access to the same core data, which is in the land registry. Starting from 2005, Estonia introduced also, in a sense, the ultimate trust-building exercise of modern democracies, voting over internet. And a couple of weeks ago, we had, 2 months ago actually, we had last parliament elections where over 40% of the votes were cast over internet, and those votes were from more than 120 different countries where Estonians were at the time of voting. Without having an internet voting, there would not be possible to, for them to participate in the voting. Let's move a bit ahead in our timeline and get closer to the present times when the service development really started to boom in 10, 12 years ago. Digital signature was also duplicated to mobile identity services. keyless signature infrastructure, which is supporting also the same trust building exercises. And for many countries in very, very sensitive areas, such as e-health, biobank of genome of the society, where right now over 25% of society's genome is sequenced, and part of the biobank were established. But most importantly, the day-to-day e-health data for me, for my children, for my family doctor is accessible. And this is now something which on the day number one is not giving a huge value to the end user, but everybody understands that by sharing my also health data builds a better life for the future. And when we are asking why people in the age of 70 go and give the genome for sequencing, because they know that during their lifetime, the personalized medicine will not be on the market for them. But they say they do it for the sake of their children and grandchildren, because that builds a value to the next generations who come after that. And this is a reflection of trusting public regulatory framework for the genome research and biobanks in Estonia, trusting also internet and digital channels for that purpose. And this is, in a sense, an ultimate trust manifestation that I share my very sensitive data for the sake of the future. And the other services are following up after that. And now maybe let's move to the next slide, where we glance already a little bit of the future. And on the timeline, of course, the most interesting part becomes started last year and is moving on right now, where so-called proactive government or government and public services, where you don't need to be involved at all to have a service, were introduced. So we have 3 layers of the service. One is something which takes place automatically without you initiating the service, and you will be only informed that your driver's license was renewed with your last photo, or the latest photo we have in the public databases, and based on the medical records results which we had from the public health database. So here you go, this is your renewed driver's license. Or there are some services which require, where government is proactive and saying that your car inspection time is over. Here are the 3 closest inspection points for your permanent address. Would you like us to book a time for you for the car technical inspection? And the third one is something where people need to initiate something. They need to be active on starting the service. And those are, say, things like selling a car, changing real estate, changing the location, getting married, etc., etc. And when we looked, then most of the services which government is providing are the ones which are easily automatable, where machine learning, artificial intelligence learns already from the customer behavior, their expectation to the service. And this is something which we recognize right now is, first of all, not doable without giving an access to the data. Secondly, not doable without having a quality of data assured. Thirdly, not possible without having an interoperability framework in place where different databases can share those or have an access to particular fields of data. And finally, it's something where end users still always have a control over data and over the services. We can always stop that service, which included also our acceptance. So this is a very shortly the Estonia timeline, where I try to highlight only and only those issues very relevant to the access to the data and interoperability. And my last picture shows also a little bit something where I started from. I think, Jonathan, you have also one more picture appearing when I said that Estonia is recognized as country with a lowest investment, or not lowest, but 10 times less investing per capita than other OECD countries, and output is much higher. So this is in a sense also recognizable evidence, which we never tried to achieve, but it was a rather opposite. It was built for the end users, and later on the recognition was achieved. And thank you once again for having me on that webinar.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lenar. I might take the moderator's prerogative and ask one quick question. Just to keep us on track on time, Lenar, I'll ask that maybe you just give us a minute or two response. But it would be really interesting to build off your last point about, in this really strong system that has a lot of trust embedded in it, one of your last points about still ensuring users or citizens in the system have control and insight into their data. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about how individuals can track how their data is being shared and used, especially as you think about this proactive government services. That implies a lot of data usage, which may not necessarily be immediately apparent. And so how do citizens have the insight and access to understanding how their data is used and represented, such that they continue to have trust even as these new services are layered on top of the existing ecosystem?
Thank you. The bit of the visual explanation is also in the very, very, very first slide, but I can start already talking it very briefly. Every individual has a digital access with the help of digital authentication tools to the state portal, where they can see what government knows about me, all my latest data, and if there is something I want to change. Say my address is different, or some service preferences are different. I have changed my preferential email address or mobile phone number. I can change the data. And secondly, I can also see so-called data usage log. The log shows me on what date, which institution, for what type of digital service accessed data that concerns my data. And my data is not just accessing my name, but it's also house of mine, family of mine, health of mine. And you can see, for example, if a traffic police stops you next to the road, then the data query case about my car plate and me as a driver will be initiated in the digital government framework. And the moment later, I can see from that data portal also the fact that who was that policeman who stopped me, and I see also what time, where, and on what purposes was I stopped. So all the real life instances also are, which are using the digital components of the data, will also be accessible for me. And this gives me actually the control over data, where I see who has used and how, and I can always approach data ombudsman or a data protection department to help me to understand in the cases where I don't understand why my data was accessed, to learn about it, and if needed, they will also initiate the investigation against that particular civil servant who has accessed data about me without my permission.
Great, thank you so much. I do want to be very cognizant of the time, but we do have one quick follow-up in the chat here. And just wanted to ask if private entities have access to the databases that have been set up. And if so, how is data shared with them without compromising privacy? And if you could just answer in one minute, Leonard, just so we stay on track. Thank you.
Answer is yes. They can, the data is shared with them, but once again, in Estonia, we don't share the data, but we give an access to the data. So if a private entity has a question, does Linnar Viik live in that address? And this is, for example, when I go and open my bank account and I give my address. Oh, actually, I don't need to give my address, because if I go to bank to open my account, I say my name, I say my ID code, and they ask, is that your address? Because they can query that particular field of data. They don't know, they don't have an access to all the data, but only to that field of data and part of data which concerns the service they are at the moment providing. Insurance company knows only one part of data, banker only one part of data, the car repairman knows one part of data, utility company, if I want to have an ADSL installed to my house or any other service provided to my house, they can access also the utilities infrastructure data to see how is a better way to provide the service. So you don't share the data with private companies, but you give them an access based on the service they are entitled and licensed to provide. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Leonard. Really appreciate the presentation and insights. We're going to turn it over to Venki now. And Venki, let me pull up your presentation. Just one moment.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So my name is Venkatesh Hariharan. Most people call me Venki, and I'm a senior fellow at the IDFC Institute, which is an organization that has, it's a think and do tank. We work with policymakers across India, and we also help them with implementing programs. So we recently got a grant from Omidyar Network to set up something called the Data Governance Network. And we felt that privacy needs to be looked at from multiple perspectives. And you know, we can't look at it from just purely privacy maximization, but you have to also look at how do you maximize the value of data. And I think as part of that overall effort, one of the understanding that we came to was that industry also needs to be sensitized to the concerns around privacy. And we set up something called the Privacy Working Group along with the Digital Lenders Association of India. So if you can go to the second slide. Jonathan, can you go to the second slide?
Sorry, just one moment, Venki. Apologies, a little technical difficulty here.
No problem. I'll just talk through that.
Yeah, we'll be with you in just 1 second.
So the context in India is that there has been a lot of concern around privacy, and the Indian government recently, the Supreme Court rather, recently passed a judgment saying that Indians have a fundamental right to privacy. And as part of that, there is a committee that was created to create a bill around privacy, and that committee reframed the debate in a very interesting way by saying that by shifting the responsibility from the users to service providers. So currently the norm was that caveat emptor or buyer beware. And from there, the onus is now shifted to the industry to ensure that they manage that data responsibly. And it also prescribes civil and criminal liabilities for misuse of data. Another interesting thing is that, compared to other geographies, the way the language has been structured is it basically implies that there is a relationship of trust between the service provider and the users. So the bill introduced terms called data fiduciary. So if I am storing your data, I am a data fiduciary to you, and you are the data principal. You're not the data subject, as other geographies term it. And I think that's a very important mindset shift, which completely resets the expectation. And we felt that it would be good to work with industry to see how they respond, and also work proactively to build responsive institutions. The the concern that the people who framed the bill have is that once the bill is in force, the data protection authority should not get flooded with complaints. So the logic that they employed is that if industry creates self-regulatory organizations, then some issues can be sorted out within that self-regulatory organization. Issues that cannot be sorted out at that level can be escalated to the sectoral regulator. So that may be the insurance authority or the banking authority or the healthcare authority. And finally, if that also does not work, it goes to the data protection authority. So the idea is to kind of sort out the challenges and the complaints at source, as close to source as possible. So we felt that we identified the Digital Lenders Association as one of the organizations that we could work with. We will also be working with other organizations in banking, healthcare. We're looking at working with the smart city initiatives in the Indian government to create a privacy working group there. The Digital Lenders Association is a very young organization, about 3 years old, but this industry has attracted a huge amount of venture capital. The DLAI, as they call it, now has almost more than 50 members attracted in just a short span of time. So we've put that. So we've created this working group, and we identified some key stakeholders who had a long-term commitment to privacy and worked with them to set up this working group. Can we go to the next slide? So the terms of reference for the working group is to review the Justice Sri Krishna Committee report and the Personal Data Protection Bill, the draft Personal Data Protection Bill. Also come up with an impact assessment for the DLAI members. The challenge, of course, for industry is that most of these people are busy setting up their businesses, building their user base, etc., and the technology base, etc. So understandably, these are all people with very little time. So what we thought is, let's create a briefing paper which summarizes the impact of the report and follow the what we call the 3A model: awareness, appreciation, and adoption. So ensure that all the DLAI members are broadly aware of the impact of the privacy bill. Work with them to do workshops so that they appreciate the impact of it on their businesses, and work with them to ensure that the self-regulatory norms are adopted. So the other goal also is to ensure that the industry people look at, understand the bill, and then also represent to policymakers in terms of how the bill affects them. So, for example, the bill has certain norms saying that you have to limit data collection. Some of the people in the industry have argued saying that at this point in time, sometimes we collect, for example, telecom data, and we don't know exactly how that has an impact. So the thing is, the goal is that tomorrow you will be able to correlate that data and understand how telecom data correlates to better credit ratings. At this point in time, if you limit that collection, then you are actually ending up curbing innovation. So the idea here with the Sri Krishna Committee report and the privacy bill is to maximize the value of data while minimizing the harms of privacy. And this kind of a healthy exchange of information helps the government also to understand how that can be done. Can we go to the next slide? So the risks and opportunities for the digital lenders are that, one is, I think, fundamentally, it's a reset of operations, because if you're moving from a caveat emptor to a caveat venditor kind of a scenario, it's a complete sea change in how they manage, store, process data. There are severe regulatory risks in the form of restrictions on business and punishments for violation, and it's a huge impact on user trust. The opportunity for the industry is that they will be able to sync with global data protection laws and operate across geographies. We also visualize that user trust will be a competitive advantage, because digital lending is not a market where winner can take all. You do not have the kind of network effects that you have in, say, social net media, etc., or messaging services like WhatsApp, etc. So we expect that user trust will become a competitive advantage. Can we go to the next slide? So the political economy for the industry is that currently India is going through elections, and a new government is expected to be formed next month. And once the new government is formed, the bill will be tabled in Parliament, and the Parliament will call for consultation. So it gives an opportunity for the industry to represent their views in front of the government. It's also an opportunity to showcase India's thought leadership in terms of data protection in the fintech sector in the global context. Can we go to the next slide? So in summary, what we aim to do with this privacy working group is to generate impactful industry-specific recommendations and engage with key internal and external stakeholders. And the goal is to impact public policy in such a way that we can grow the digital lending industry while protecting users' privacy. So let me stop there and wait for questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Venki. This is Kay McGowan. That was great. I'm going to usurp Jonathan's moderator prerogative since I'm here in the room and ask a question. I'm really interested in this idea of how you foster user trust in societies as diverse as India's. Obviously, the investments and innovations that have been put in place in the last few years have really expanded the ability of lower income, perhaps lower literacy segments of the Indian population to start participating in these digital services, whether they're public services or commercial services. But that obviously brings a lot of questions around informed consent, which we've seen has extreme limitations even in highly literate populations. So I'm wondering how you guys are thinking about consent and bringing these more kind of vulnerable populations into this potentially exciting but also somewhat fraught new world of the data era. Thanks.
So there are two parts to that. One is, how do you take users' consent in a better manner? Can we do that better? And that is, to some extent, it's a legal challenge. It's a UI UX challenge. And what we have seen is that in countries like India, you need to take consent in multiple languages. We also have a significantly large population that is not literate. So therefore, people are experimenting with providing notice through audio files, through videos, etc. And we have seen in some of the surveys around privacy that people have also expressed interest in these kind of notices, which are in video format, since they don't understand what exactly is happening. The other thing is what we are also hearing from people who work on financial inclusion in really impoverished communities, etc., is that the first question everybody asks is when they are feeding their data into a mobile phone, what happens to my data? So everybody across the board is really concerned about that, and the industry needs to be sensitive to that. On the technology side, there is models like the digital empowerment and protection architecture, which provide the framework for giving consent. And there's also mechanisms for the consent to be audited at the back end. I'm sorry, there is some crackers going off in the background. I hope that's not a disturbance.
Nope, we can hear you.
Great. So there are frameworks like DEPA, which are digital frameworks for sharing data. The other aspect is, you have to, where there are misuses of data, there have to be strong punitive measures. So for example, in today's newspaper, I read that an organization that counterfeited medicines was given a very stringent fine by the judge. And he said that, this kind of playing with people's life cannot be allowed, and therefore we are imposing a very stiff fine on you for violating and imitating a drug. I think those kind of punitive measures will also be important. So it's basically the carrot and the stick kind of an approach. Does that answer you? It's a very wide-ranging answer, I know.
It does. Thank you.
That's great, Venki. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions for Venki? We're pretty much right on track for timing. So if not, we can certainly move forward to Anit's presentation. But any burning questions before we move on? We'll give it one minute in the chat. Yeah, and you can also just unmute yourself and ask directly as well. And if we have a few moments at the end, we can have further discussion, further questions about the overall discussion. So give it one more minute, and then I will start to pull up Anit's presentation. Great, thank you very much, Venki. We will move on to Anit's presentation now.
Hello, can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Not sure how my hardware and digital technologies would hold up, but this is great. Thank you very much for the invitation, and really pleased to be in the company of 23 people that I see online across the globe, I presume. My name is Anit Mukherjee. I'm a Polish Fellow at the Center for Global Development. We are also a think and do tank. I think it's the it's kind of the way that we define ourselves these days. And I think what we have been doing in over the last 2-3 years is to look at closely the way in which the relationship between the citizen and the state is changing due to introduction of digital technology. And this is not only limited to an advanced country like Estonia or India, where also I come from, but across the globe, basically. We look at countries in sub-Saharan Africa, mostly Nigeria, Tanzania, Kenya. We do some work in Bangladesh as well as in India, of course, and in countries like Mexico and Bolivia. So we have a wide range of experiences, and I'll not go into everything, but I'd like to share a few of the ideas related to how citizens and state, the relationships are changing, and how trust and consent are becoming integral to those to the delivery of governance. So what does data sharing mean for public service delivery? And as Jonathan said, I mostly work in this area. So the interactions that I will talk about are mostly the citizen and the state, but obviously some of that moves over to the area of private sector. Absolutely, there is no doubt about that. And some of the stuff that Venki has talked about is also relevant to our discussion. So the first point to note is that there is the use of personal data in a digital environment to redesign public services create both opportunities and challenges. And I think both Linar and Venki mentioned some of that. There is, however, a little understanding of how digital processes often mandate sharing of data through forced or implicit consent. So, and I'll come to that in a concrete example. Sometimes you give up a lot of your personal information just because the scheme, the design of that benefit or the service or the scheme forces you to do so. Without that, you are not going to be able to access that service. And also implicitly, because sometimes at the back end, a lot of databases get merged, and those are not very visible to the person, to the data holder. And what we feel is that the role of digital technology is increasing in three basic settings. One is systems which provide a wide-ranging and universal ID. This is Estonia, this is India, this is Pakistan, this is going into Bangladesh as well, in Indonesia. So around 140 countries have some form of electronic ID systems, and these are generating huge amounts of data for governance. And second is, I think, mobiles. I think that a lot of these delivery systems are moving onto mobile platform. As somebody, as a previous presenter mentioned, telecom data is becoming a gold mine of a lot of insight, and how we use this data is going to be critical for going forward. And the third is the massive explosion in financial products and financial inclusion and payments, which again are linked with mobile technology and linked with ID. So these three taken together, this ecosystem is generating voluminous amounts at real-time data, which some of us are still grappling to understand what that means for governance systems. And there are complementarities between the three. As I mentioned, there's ID, which is used for efficient know your customer, and Linar mentioned about using opening bank accounts. We have seen in India, 350 million bank accounts were opened in 3 years, a lot of it due to the use of Aadhaar and the eKYC. Mobile access to information and digital transactions, and finance offers a motivation and additional motivation to also roll out ID and mobile networks, because a lot of the revenues generated from mobile networks are coming from their financial aspect rather than communication. So those are three very broad kind of trends that we see, and globally and across the world. Next slide, please. So in this area, in this broad kind of trend that we see globally, how does the data sharing with government, especially with public institutions, increase trust. And our work on the ground, and I'll go into a little bit in detail in the next few slides, but what we find is that there are 5 essential ingredients to increase trust when a beneficiary is parting or sharing his or her data with the government. One is greater agency. So this is about having more control over the benefits or services that you receive from the government. Second is higher efficiency, which for a lot of people across the world is essentially reduced corruption. The impression of state, the mistrust of the state from a citizen's point of view is often mediated by his or her experience with corruption. So if you visibly reduce corruption and by perforce you're improving efficiency of the system, of the governance system, then you have better trust and people trust these systems more. Third, I would say is better quality. When you have a feedback mechanism where you ask the beneficiaries about their experience with the system, and if there is a positive feedback and if the government can capture that feedback, then one finds that there is a more trust. And I'll come to all these examples concretely in the next few slides. The fourth and the fifth are improved equity, essentially targeting inclusion and marginalized groups. Often these groups are the ones who are not included in traditional systems. And if digital systems can target and include marginalized groups, then that is a plus, improves trust. And finally, it's increasing empowerment, which is giving beneficiaries or subjects better information, choice, and voice. And that's how we have kind of framed it. Next slide, please. So here's a pretty quick description of one program that we looked at closely. This is Rajasthan, a state in India, which is about the size of Germany, both in terms of size and population. What they decided to do is to re-enroll every person into a card, which on the left-hand side is the person, and then the middle there are 3 or 4 steps. And then finally, you get a card with the person's photograph. And interestingly, if we can click one, sorry, I forgot to remove the animation. The person is actually the head of the family, and this is a family card. So you have a listing of the head of the family and the members. That head of the family has to be a woman, and that was the mandate of the scheme. And this was in the previous government, so we don't know what will happen because the government of the state changed. But latest, what we have found, what I've heard is that this will remain in some way, shape, or form. And what this card is supposed to do is something what Linar was alluding to, where the state is proactive in providing benefits to this set of people who are included in this family. So, for example, if somebody is listed at age 62, at 65, if she would become eligible for an old age pension, then the state will just inform that I have included you in the old age pension. Can we have one click, please? Yeah. So here you see what kind of information this data subject is giving up. In the card itself, there is a bank account number, which is circled the top circle, and then the Aadhaar number, which is the bottom circle. And those 2 are mandatory. So you have to have a bank account and an Aadhaar number, and those are pretty private data points, plus your photograph and the photograph of other members. The other members could be listed with or without Aadhaar, which essentially everybody probably does have an Aadhaar. So that is there. And then there's date of birth and address. So there's a lot of information that you are sharing, but essentially whether you get the benefit of this sharing or not will depend on how much you trust the system, which is exactly what we'll look at in the next slide. And one more click, please. Yeah. So we looked at 3 programs. The top one is a direct benefit transfer of cooking gas subsidy, which is given to about 180 million households. Obviously, Rajasthan is not 180 million, but it has about 30 million households which get that subsidy. We looked at pensions, social pensions given to everyone who qualifies on an age and a means basis, and the public distribution system where food rations for about 82 million beneficiaries in the state, where 50% are below poverty line. These are food rations given in kind. And if you look at the blue bars, it seems that if I were a government servant and trying to implement this program and with all the complexity, I would be pretty happy with these numbers. However, there is a lot of gray, not much red, but quite a bit of gray areas, and literally gray areas because we don't know, or the beneficiaries didn't have an idea about how the system is better or worse than the previous one. So the blue bars are people who think that the digital system is better unequivocally. The red ones are unequivocally they are worse. The gray ones are we don't know. So basically qualified kind of support for the system. Next slide, please. And here in Rajasthan, as well as in other places, what we are looking at is that people who are more digitally literate have greater trust in these digital systems. And here we just are publishing a small report on the primary education stipend program in Bangladesh, where there's about 13 million stipends are given out to mothers on a mobile money platform, which is called SureCash. So every 6 months, the mother gets half-yearly stipends on a mobile money account. And here we see that being able to read and write SMS, which we take as an instrument of digital literacy, kind of full digital literacy, is associated with a positive opinion of the system, saying that there's more agency, that they can get money when they would want to, and also owning a phone, honestly. So having a phone is an important element of this whole digital ecosystem. And owning a phone is associated with being able to read or write SMS. We tested whether not being able to read or write SMS is significantly different statistically than in their perception, and we found that yes, it was. So, but overall, I must say that the overall perception was 80% positive. But here we are talking about those who said that they didn't have a positive opinion of the system. So essentially what this means is greater digital literacy and leads to greater trust. Not causality, I would be careful, but at least correlation. Next slide, please. And this one, we looked at a very advanced system, and this is kind of approaching the first two systems were more or less, I would say, moderately digitally literate systems. But this one is approaching, this is Andhra Pradesh in India, and it is approaching, in some ways, the digital sophistication is approaching Estonia. Obviously, we can't be Estonia overnight, as Linar said, but it's approaching Estonia. So it's a very advanced digital system. As you can see, they're using this state is using digital ID and technology to improve service delivery, minimize exclusion, active beneficiary feedback, combining administrative and survey data, and reinforcing local accountability. So all this is kind of coming together. And as you can see, the gentleman holding up an interesting machine, which has an iris reader, a fingerprint reader, and a face camera all integrated. So the whole ecosystem of authentication is being integrated into one machine, and that is being used to deliver different kinds of services. And if you look at the kind of the support, it's pretty impressive. We looked at three things: the PDS, which is the food rations, 70% support; social pensions, which is a distribution in cash; on authentication, it's 84%; and land records, which was stunned us, but it was 97% of people. This is digitized land records, which is linked to your ID, which is somewhat like what Estonia does. So that has 97% approval from landowners. This is not people who are tenant farmers. So I think what we have in some way, my timer has gone off, so I'm over my 15-minute limit. But what it shows is that you have a lot of trust that is built into the system, a lot of support. But if you look at the next slide, what we found very interesting was that we asked people two things. One is, do you like the new system compared to the old one? And as you can see in the blue bars, there's a lot of people gave reasons why they like the new system, like don't get diverted, so it's corruption. Grains are delivered on time, so efficiency. Weighing system has improved, again, corruption, efficiency. Sometimes people say nothing has become worse. However, we also asked these people who said the new system is better, which is 390 out of 560 households, do they think something has become worse? Interestingly, some people say that transaction time has increased, again, the blue bar on the right side. And some people also said, about 40% said authentication failures are frequent. That's why they don't see, that's the drawback of the system, although they like it overall. But the 27% or 33% who said system is worse, which is the red bars, 100% of them said that they don't like it because authentication failures are frequent. So in this kind of a very advanced digital environment where you're doing everything on the hardware, you are transforming your digital governance systems at the back end, even the interaction between the beneficiary and the technology environment mediates your trust in the system. But however, if you look at the yellow box, the basic idea of increasing trust is because nobody can take my grains now. So the agency over your entitlement, the efficiency of the delivery, these are things that that beneficiaries kind of take away from the system as something which has become better. So finally, last slide. What do we mean when how these sharing of data and use of technology, use of personal authentication, how can it improve trust? And I think we have 4 channels which are not mutually exclusive. One is the integration and an analysis of real-time administrative data, which there is a box in notes from the field where it shows that this person was couldn't be authenticated, then had to go back, but they got a call to come back within 15 minutes because somebody was remotely monitoring the authentication failures. I think beneficiary feedback and monitoring of service quality, if there is visible improvement in that, even while giving up some of your data to the government, I think that shows that gives people a sense of more trust in the system. The third point, and this is coming out very clearly in many of the studies we are doing across the world, is the governments promise a lot through these digital systems. They promise that corruption will be reduced, you will be included in the system, efficiency will improve. And if there is no visible improvement in those or visible move towards those promises being met, very soon the trust dissipates. We looked at fuel subsidy reform in Nigeria, and everybody knows about what's happening with Gilets Jaunes protests and stuff. But in Nigeria, they haven't been able to reform their absolutely crazy subsidies that they give on petroleum because the people don't trust the government to actually do a good job and not fritter it away. And last, I think it's the issue, and the Nigeria case also for us illustrated that if you can visibly, the people understand that there is, the government is doing something to reduce corruption and leakage through use of digital delivery mechanisms where they are giving up a lot of, they're giving a lot of information to the government, the trust is visibly increased. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer questions. But thank you very much for this opportunity to share some of our work with this audience.
Great, thank you so much, Aneet. I have a question, and welcome others to chime in as well. So my first question is about the use of personal data in the system. So a lot of what you're talking about is trust at the service delivery level, right? That the particular service will or will not be delivered as expected. I know you and I have talked a bit about redressal systems and what happens when individuals feel their data is inaccurate or being misrepresented. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing at that level, how individuals are gaining trust in the system and the way their data is being used in order to then get to that service delivery level that you're discussing here.
Great question. I think the second point in the slide is the beneficiary feedback. So what we see in a lot of ways is that the service, at the point of service, systems are changing faster than the feedback systems are being performed. So sometimes the feedback systems are still very much in the old world where you go to, you send in some, hand in a piece of paper, or now it's like, oh, we have a grievance portal. But what we are talking about is there is active feedback seeking from the state or from entities. And by the way, these feedback mechanisms in Andhra, for example, is all done in a private sector mode. So there's a call center that has been set up, and they're using a lot of those feedback loops that the private sector uses. It's nothing different from what Amazon uses for rating products or any other e-commerce company. So I think they're using those kind of ideas to rank or to solicit feedback actively. Secondly, what they're also doing, and these systems, the way it builds trust, is that it also puts accountability very clearly on the people who are delivering that service. So if I know that this ration shop, we call them, but the place where you get your food ration, has 20% authentication failure, there is somebody who goes there and figures out why that 20% is happening month after month. So that kind of a redressal and feedback loop, where the government goes out and seeks proactively the views of the people through call centers, through direct mailers, through SMS messages, builds some kind of trust. And if they see that is then there's an improvement at the service delivery level, that reinforces that trust.
Great, thank you. We have a question here, which I'm just going to read to you so as to not misrepresent in summarizing it. So state governments in India are building huge databases without much concern for privacy. A leak of data could significantly destroy user trust and also bring positive use cases to an abrupt halt. How do we sensitize governments that they are custodians of data and need to build better privacy into their systems?
I think that's a great question. So the way, state governments are in no way different from central government in their hunger for more data. And the way Indian system is set up, there are state resident data hubs which are being used to warehouse a lot of this data. And I think there is a leaf to be taken from the private sector here, both in terms of the way the private sector has mismanaged data, as well as what proactive steps they're taking to ensure that things don't go out of hand. And again, there is an issue of capacity. Even the best functioning states across the globe. I mean, there are other countries which are also pretty much advanced in collecting and warehousing data, do have to be on their guard, because it's not an easy thing to safeguard the data, and first of all to reduce the risk of leakage of the data, like we have seen in many other instances in social media platforms, for example, or proactively seeking user consent and protecting privacy. And those two things, one of the crazy things about this whole issue and why I'm interested is that there are very few countries in the developing world which actually have some kind of an idea of how to protect massive amounts of citizen data that they warehouse. And not only India, but many other countries. And GDPR coming in has kind of muddied the waters a little bit, because everybody now wants to move that framework. But whether that is the appropriate framework or not is a question that needs to be answered. So I take the point that governments are building databases, so are many people across the world, including the private sector, and we need to have better understanding of what that means in terms of user privacy. That's for sure.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Any final burning questions for Anit before we wrap up here? Great. Well, thank you all for joining us, and thanks especially to Linar, Venki, and Anit for your great presentations. You know, we'll be consolidating and writing up a summary of this to share. I think there's a lot here. It strikes me how, you know, to no one's surprise, the idea of trust is a highly complex construct, and you know, I think we heard a number of different ways to approach that today, from both institutional investments and technological and legislative investments, as well as some, you know, specific kind of real-world practices that are starting to look at building individuals' trust. You know, I think two things just very quickly that struck me were the distinction between data sharing as kind of an active function and creating systems that allow access to data, and then building on top of that responsible ways to track and share how the exchange of data is happening. And then also really the importance, I think we heard this throughout, the importance of public sector and public service delivery as a lever in building a foundation for trust among people. But you know, we'll digest this conversation more in the coming weeks, and stay tuned for a summary of it. And thank you all again. We'll be making this recording available, and stay tuned as well for our next webinar. We're exploring a number of ideas and welcome, you know, inputs from this group, what you all would like to hear next in this series under the broad umbrella of, you know, empowering individuals with their data. One idea we've started to toy with, potentially as a next theme, is understanding the role of aggregate data in generating social good. So, you know, emerging models around data trusts and data collaboratives. But, you know, welcome feedback on that, and want to really make this webinar series as useful for this community as possible. So thank you all again, and we will be closing the webinar now. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.